I don't know who picked this subject, but it's because it's incredibly complex. It goes off in all sorts of directions. So I'm trying to confine it to three tranches, as it were, 3 sessions. And the first one, roughly speaking, is BC. The second one is AD. And the third one is last days stroke end times. And I felt that really the whole thing, we really need to go back to the beginning, even before the flood and what have you. And so the whole question, I'm looking at Babylon as I used to define it as a JW, the world empire of false religion. And we know where it began after the flood. And we know the way it progressed through history. And it became incredibly complicated because of the workings of all sorts of different pagan religions and philosophers. It's basically about all of these things here. It's about 2 seeds. It's about 2 gods, although only one of them is the true God, of course. It's about 2 women, and it's about 2 cities. And they're all in inverted commas here. I'm sure we've all seen images like this. This is an image from the legend of Zeus and Europa. And that in itself is an incredible subject. The woman riding the beast. But we don't come to that bit for quite some time. Now, I'm not quite sure what's happened to my screen here, as usual. But we're starting with Genesis 3:16. Then the Lord God said to the serpent, because you have done this, cursed are you more than all the livestock and more than any animal of the field. On your belly you shall go, and dust you shall eat all the days of your life. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. So that's enmity between the serpent seed and the messianic seed. Of course, it's the messianic seed, Jesus, whose heel is bruised, and the serpent seed, whose head is finally completely crushed. So initially, that's enmity between Adam and Eve and the serpent, but also, of course, by proxy between them. Historically, it's between Christ Jesus and Satan. And it's about 2 women, which are Jerusalem above, who is our mother, and Babylon the Great. So it's about 2 women who are also 2 cities, in inverted commas, as it were. And so when later we look at the maps of the 4 divisions of Babylon's statue, Nebuchadnezzar's statue, we will see that they're always centered on Jerusalem and Babylon. So these are the 2 seed of the woman, as it were. And it's interesting, I think we come to it later, that the false religion of Zoroaster means seed of the woman. And that we see that. And another thing to mention in passing, it's no coincidence that both Vishnu and Achilles are both injured in their most vulnerable part, which of course is the heel. And so we see this intertwining of theology, the Bible, philosophy, religion, from the very beginning. And as has been mentioned before, Satan, the power given to Satan, he's still ruling the entire inhabited earth, is absolutely immense. And he's anticipated every single Christian biblical symbol, as it were, from the beginning, and brought up the counterfeits way before Christ. So these 2 biblical women I have defined as Jews are called the wife of Yahweh in Isaiah, or Jehovah, if you will, whereas the Christians are called the bride of Christ. Now, collectively, I see Jew and Gentile believers together as the Israel of God, of Galatians 6. And of course, that's all via the Holy Spirit. So we have a Christian biblical trinity of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. But here we begin some of the incredible unravelings that paganism was brought in. because when we come to the name of Nimrod, you'll find that he could be at least 4 different people in history. The word Nimrod is only used in the Bible, the name Nimrod. So initially, by the time of Nimrod, obviously after the flood, we have these main gods, as it were, false gods, Baal, Enlil, and El, and these are in the area which we know collectively as Mesopotamia, which means between the 2 rivers, and Sumeria or Shinar, Sumer, but it's also later known as Akkad, Babylon. But the whole area, according to the Bible, was always called Babylonia. So we've got the false god with the wife of Baal, who later transmogrifies into the Queen of Heaven. Now, the main female deity back in the day, a couple of 100 years after the flood, was Inanna. Now, the name Semiramis is controversial because an extremely good book, I'm sure you've all heard of, is The Two Babylons by Alexandra Hislop. And Semiramis is named there as the wife of Nimrod. But because of this strange mother and son transmogrification, Semiramis becomes, when Nimrod dies, fairly young, Semiramis is made somehow into his mother, and Nimrod is made into the sun. He's then turned into a star, and there we have the beginnings of astrology, etc. And thereby, Satan has already anticipated the virgin and the child, because this mother and son worship went throughout the world way before Christ, way before Christ. It's gone to virtually every land. And so, unfortunately, in recent years, a certain person who is otherwise a very good writer, called Jonathan Sarfati, has dumped the entire book, The Two Babylons, because Semiramis was also the name of a goddess ruler in the time of Nebuchadnezzar, some 1400 years later. And so he's dumped the entire book because he thinks that Hislop has mistaken the later Semiramis for the earlier one, or vice versa. Whereas I think there's very good reason to believe that there were 2. And it's certainly no reason to dump the book. So I would always promote that brilliant book, The Two Babylons. But it's a very, very complicated, complex book, as I'm sure anyone that's ever looked at it. The way that Baal and the Queen of Heaven, etc., have gone through all those different names, Ishtar, Isis, Ashtaroth, Artemis, etc., throughout the ages is absolutely baffling. And when you look at the history of all these people, their myths and legends and histories are intertwined so immensely that it's very difficult to work it all out. So I always say that I always see it as Mystery Babylon the Great, which of course is not a word, not a title used until the book of Revelation, where she is also the whore riding the beast. And that's another thing that will come up again and again in this ramble through history, because the whore is a religious whore riding the political beast. And the beasts, of course, are the beasts of Daniel converted into the beasts of Revelation. And the false prophet, that is the second beast. We see that from the later in Revelation, which I'm not going to look at now, but this is just by way of introduction. So we've got a false system of religion throughout the world and a false prophet in the last days. And that whore is a religious whore riding the political beast, is how I see it anyway. I'm not, so by the way, saying that any of this is in way infallible, because it most certainly isn't. So by the time we get to our days, certainly for the first 2,000 years, well, up until the 19th century, the Antichrist was always the Holy Roman Empire, the Pope, and Catholicism, etc. Finally, I believe it will be some kind of unholy Roman Empire of the EU with some kind of global alliance with false religion riding it, until that itself Babylon the Great is destroyed, because the beast turns on Babylon the Great finally. So we don't really know what happens there. And that's the false Trinity, Father, Mother, Son. Some of you know that Catholicism has substituted the Mother, Mary, for the Holy Spirit. And this is why Catholicism worships the Queen of Heaven, which of course is banned and quite clearly revealed in the book of Isaiah and Jeremiah as false worship. But they absolutely insist that the real Mary is in fact the Queen of Heaven, or the Lady of the Nations, as some scriptures call her. So again, we started off, we're already deep into complexity. But Genesis is history. So I've got various books on history here. I've got David Roll and Breasted and all of these books, and they'll all tell you different versions, and they'll all give you different dates. But I am basing mine on Genesis history. All scripture is inspired of God. And so secular history has lots of evidence to show that the survivors of Noah's flood on the table of nations, this is just one interpretation of them, via the descendants of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So this is one interpretation, and were real historical figures. CMI and Creation have both done very good DVDs and articles on the grandsons of Noah, and would be interested to know, for instance, even in Wales, the origin of the word Gymraeg, the Cymraeg, the Welsh, is Gomerag. It comes from Gomer. So let's start with a bit of and it's unparalleled history. I'm sure you've seen this quote from William F. Albright. He wasn't particularly a Bible believer, by the way. He was a very eminent archaeologist. He said, Genesis 10 stands absolutely alone in ancient literature, without a remote parallel, even among the Greeks, where we find the closest approach to a distribution of peoples in a genealogical framework. The Table of Nations remains an astonishingly accurate document. So that's in Genesis 10 and 11. An astonishingly accurate document without parallel in the world of BC. I say William F. Albright, for instance, didn't believe that Genesis 1 was literal, but he, like all honest Hebrew scholars and archaeological scholars, tells you that the Bible stands alone. So here we find one of the very earliest depictions from, roughly speaking, 2200 BC. This is the worship of Enki, he's the god of the air. Sorry, Enlil is the god of the air. Enki is the god of the sea. Worshipped by Namu. This is possibly Nimrod in Babel. This comes from Ur of the Chaldees. Now, Nimrod could also in history be known as Enmerkar in the Sumerian chronicles. And their gods, as they were, Enlil, Enki, and Sin. Because as you can see from the crescent moon here and the star, that immediately rings a bell, of course, because most Muslim nations to this day use the star and the crescent moon as their symbol. And the moon god, Sin, became the moon god. Gods could become goddesses, and vice versa. I say the transformation back and to between this multiplicity of gods and goddesses and mythological figures and fallen angels is just mind-boggling, baffling. I'd never be able to get my head around it or explain all of it, because these are, I'm looking at historical documents here, but I'm putting the Bible first and foremost. So we can also happily assume, I think, this is a depiction of a tower, a Sumerian depiction of a tower, where supposedly Nimrod is worshipping the gods of the sky here. And we can see all sorts of lesser bits and pieces down here, including people who are half man and half bull. And that's another very common theme in this multiplicity of gods and goddesses. So as I say, that reminds me something that we said earlier. The reason that you can't find Arthur in historical documents is because that was not his name. That was a battle title, just as Nimrod is probably a title and not his actual name. We think of Artaxerxes. There were quite a lot of Artaxerxes, as there were, who's the guy that beat up the Jews about the time of the Maccabees. That again is a common title. So Nimrod is not necessarily his title. His name Nimrod is variously translated as tyrant, as mighty man, or Gibor. You don't know, one of the names of God is El Gibor or El Gibor. And the word Babylon and Babel in the Bible is just the same word. And in Sumerian or Arabic, Babel means gate of God, Babilu. So Babylon, Babel, and Babel are all essentially the same word in Hebrew in the Bible. And here we begin to see there's the rest of that tablet showing some kind of tower with a Nimrod figure worshipping the moon and the stars. Now, another thing common from Nimrod onwards throughout the entire world, including South America, is Nimrod was a mighty hunter in the face of God. And one of the things he hunted were animals. You see, he's got two lions here by the tail, pretty fearless character. And down here, we've got the winged bulls, very much associated with Assyria and Sumeria. And of course, as I'll show shortly, I'm pretty certain they came from the Bible in the first place. Down here, we've got bull-headed gods and god-headed bulls and a Nimrod figure fighting a lion. And again, these kind of figures of fallen angels somehow blended with humans, and humans blended with gods and fallen angels and sphinxes and what have you. They're just utterly endless. You can search through this literature and find endless references to all of these things. The bull, generally speaking, is equated with God. Remember that when we come to Zeus and Europa, Zeus is pictured as a white bull. And so the bull and the eagle are two common synonyms, metaphors for God. Therefore, we see them combined here in these winged bulls and winged lions. I say you can go on melding these things together until the cows come home, the sacred cows come home. Why do you think they still worship cows in India? Why do they fight bulls in Spain and daub the blood on themselves? They're killing God. They're sacrificing God. Nothing much has changed. So before we close this little section, other people say that Nimrod is actually Sargon the Great. I'm not saying I believe this. I'm just trying to present a basic understanding of what most history out there thinks. Of course, there is a lot of history nowadays which is a lot better. We look at the books by David Rohl, like Genesis and Legend, etc. And we see them updating ancient history in Sumeria and Egypt to fit in with the timeline of the Bible. So people like David Rohl are doing a very good job, but of course they're not complete Bible believers, and they still will put the secular view first. So when we look at the nature of ziggurats, which the Tower of Babel almost certainly was, we see that ziggurats and have been transferred, again, literally worldwide. The ziggurats from Babel went into Egypt. The first ones in Egypt were stepped pyramids. They were ziggurats. And then they became smooth-sided pyramids. But the step-sided ziggurats are still common in Southeast Asia and South America, for instance. So it's possible, as this little blurb here says, that the Babelites under Nimrod created a false system of religion where they associated celestial objects, sun, moon, stars, planets, etc., as well as earth-based entities the gods of sea, of rivers, of storm, of water especially. We can see how that spread into witchcraft in Britain and the West, into Celtic beliefs, into Hinduism, etc. All these are very, very common. We know the first astrological signs came from Babylon. They're still used today. Now, the astonishing thing about the astrological signs is, which are used worldwide, they very rarely represent the things they're supposed to represent. So how have these common designs gone worldwide? I mean, you don't look at it. The only one you look up in the sky that looks vaguely like it is the kite. You'd have to, there's a lot of imagination gone into Orion's belt, etc. And all these other astrological signs, but they're global, they're worldwide, and they were first formulated in Babylon. Now, Akkad and Akkadia is a sort of later manifestation of Babylon. And Sumer, originally it was called Sumer from Shem, or Shinar. Shinar, Sumer, and Shem, they're all interchangeable. And then we see all these sorts of ideas, as well as their pyramids and their religion, spread worldwide pretty quickly. As I mentioned earlier, mother-son worship also manifested very, very quickly. When Semiramis became the mother of the dead Nimrod and deified him, made him a star, and therefore he was a son somehow of the Queen of Heaven. It's very, very complicated, but it's very, very common. Even in China, they've got the mother-son worship. They call it Xingmu. I think that's the mother. Now, something which we don't need to go into here, the astonishing thing that after the flood, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, they not only spread out three clear, I don't like the word racial, but that's the word I shall use, three racial lines. They've sent out three clear genetic lines throughout the earth. You can trace all peoples back to these three basic racial and genetic lines. So everything was transmitted out. So this is one of the first biblical references. It's in the Table of Nations, that's in Genesis 10. He's described as the son of Cush, the grandson of Ham, and a great-grandson of Noah. And what we have to remember about this time is that people like Noah were still alive. Shem was still alive, at least. So when all this was going on, because it is thought that one of the reasons that the Tower of Babel was built was to survive a global flood if it ever came again. That's one of the reasonings why Nimrod might have brought this thing. It was also a tower between heaven and earth, as it were. But he's called a mighty one on the earth and a mighty hunter before the Lord. Again, I think the best translation of this is, in a modern translation, a mighty hunter in the face of God. Because people have tried to say, oh, he was a great person, he was a mighty hunter. But I'm pretty certain the Bible is not saying he's a great person at all. He was not only hunting animals, he was almost certainly hunting people as well. So he was a mighty hunter before the Lord or in the face of the Lord. Now this is repeated in the first book of Chronicles, chapter 1, verse 10. And the land of Nimrod is later used in the book of Micah. It's a synonym for Assyria and Mesopotamia, as in Micah 5:6. And they shall lay waste the land of Assyria with the sword, the land of Nimrod in the entrances thereof. Thus shall he deliver us from the Assyrian when he cometh into our land and when he treadeth within our borders. I think it's probably best if we have a little break now for your comments and questions, unless you've all gone to sleep or signed off anyway. Kind of a stunned silence, I guess. It is a, I hadn't realized how utterly complex it was. I first read the two Babylons 30 years ago, and I've been a great fan of it ever since. But it's just astonishing what mankind and Satan have actually accomplished in confusing all of this. Anyway, I'm not supposed to be speaking, you're supposed to be speaking.
You mentioned global alliance, and I think today all this trying to get us all into a global alliance is the global warming scare. But
Well, that's a part of it, isn't it? With the scamdemic.
Yeah.
But it's the whole system.
The global alliance is trying that all down history.
Oh yeah. That's just the official name for it today, by the way. Those of you who don't know, the Global Alliance are the people who brought forward the Great Reset. After the scamdemic, they're going to bring everybody together and enslave us all, and then eventually put us into computers so we can be immortal. I'm not making this up, by the way, but we'll come to that at the end. The confusion began at Babylon, at Babel.
I think it does show, Philip, that Babylon is everywhere.
Yes.
It's absolutely everywhere, woven into all the mythologies and this kind of stuff. Yeah.
I always say that with the occultism, because I was a great fan of the occult before I became a Christian, that Satan down the years has simply adjusted his dress to cultural norms. So in Britain, it was all about witches and broomsticks and black cats and what have you. Whereas in Central America, the witches in Britain, we ate fly agaric mushrooms, in Norway, and Scandinavia to fly. In Central America, they rubbed psilocybin mushrooms on their legs to enable their spirits to fly. So you've got all these common themes of occultism down the ages. And they're always aided by fallen angels or avatars from heaven, messengers from heaven. They're always aided and confused by that, which of course are the demons after the first fallen angels. So it's as you say, it's everywhere.
Satan is just a copyist.
Yes.
He hasn't got an original thought in his head.
He's a very good adapter.
Yeah. And that's why gossip is so dangerous, because it just gives him ideas. He can't keep up, he can't invent mischief. There's a gossip. Oh, I can use that. That's great.
It's interesting, when I've forgotten the scripture, but we looked at it the other week. Angels are desiring to peer into, we are supposed to be, there's a staggering scripture, we're supposed to steward the mysteries of the Bible. We're supposed to not only understand them and know them, we're supposed to steward the mysteries and enlighten the angels. That's nothing to do with this talk. I shouldn't have said that, but it's quite staggering.
To speak to angels, are we? That's not.
No, we're supposed to enlighten them by our understanding, I think. Right. I forgot the exact scripture. I'm sure somebody will know where the scripture is.
I sort of partially remember it, yeah.
Yeah. Well, shall I continue the ramble? Here we are, back again to the land of Nimrod. I say it is confusing that it's Mesopotamia, but it's land between the rivers. Assyria is a later name. Babylonia is a sort of generic name for the entire Fertile Crescent. Right. So we're just going to have a quick ramble through some of the relevant moon gods and goddesses. This is another Nimrod type figure. And once again, we can see the crescent moon there. Now, the other common theme is a bull. This is supposed to be a bull, by the way. This comes from Egypt. And the first thing you'll note, one of the reasons the bull is used because of the moon is because of the bull's horns, the cow's horns, and the crescent moon. So in Egypt, the cow goddess was called Hathor, and the cow god was called Apis, A-P-I-S. And again, once again, we have winged bulls, as we do in Assyria. Because I think David Rohl makes a very good point in his book, Legend, The Genesis of Civilization, that Samaria came into Egypt. In fact, he shows you, as an interesting aside, there are lots of wadis between the Red Sea and Egypt, which were dry a couple of thousand years ago. And the Sumerians seem to have dragged their boats between the Red Sea into Egypt. They literally dragged their boats on rollers or whatever between the Red Sea and into Egypt. So virtually everything, but as everything was going into Egypt from Samaria, it was also heading east into the Indus Valley. You probably heard of the Indus Valley civilization from roughly the same time. And they share so many different myths and archaeology and geology, etc., and beliefs. It's quite amazing. And they both, unfortunately, all of them, all three countries have a legend of a local flood. So again, we're not going to go into the flood, but we know that if it was a local flood, then God's a liar, because he's never ever going to send a flood like that again. So we know it was a global flood. The geology tells us quite clearly it was a global flood. But they share all sorts of things in their ideas. So bull and cow worship was common from Babylon onwards, and it spread more or less worldwide. I mentioned the bullfight in Spain. Look up the background of bullfighting. It's quite horrific. The sacred cows in India. Look at the poor Indians, starving Indians, yet those stupid cows can eat off the stalls in the marketplace while people are starving in the gutter next to them. And they give their children sacred cow's urine to drink, and they die of cholera. Or they give them the so-called sacred Ganges water to drink, and they die of cholera. But it doesn't matter, they'll come back again as a boll weevil or whatever. You know, that's the idiocy of reincarnation, which is exactly what Semiramis and Nimrod brought into the world. The idea that you can be reborn. And of course, what is that based on? That's based on the vague, shall we say, Old Testament belief that we can be resurrected and truly born again, but not born over and over, suffering and suffering for things we don't even know that we've done, you know, and coming back as a cockroach or whatever, or a politician, you know, or something. So all of these ideas have come everywhere. I didn't know that in ancient Egypt, you know, they did the bull run. If any of you have read Hemingway or know about Spain, you'll know that he used to love to run with the bulls when he had a skinful of wine. And they do this manic bull run up in northern Spain, especially. It started in ancient Egypt, where they run around the town with bulls and maybe got gored or not, you know. But the big symbol is the crescent moon, the horns and the crescent moon. That later when we see that in Baal and bull, and it's an Ishmaelite symbol. It's an Ishmaelite symbol in the Bible. I remember years ago when David Pawson was doing his tour around Britain, promoting they were videos, video cassettes about Islam. He said, Islam isn't mentioned in the Bible. Well, I beg to differ. It's not mentioned by name, but it's certainly mentioned in the Old Testament, and it's mentioned in the book of Revelation, but not by name. So here, once again, we've got winged bulls, we've got bulls and moon worship. I'm pretty much convinced that all these bull and moon gods probably come from one of the four winged living creatures of Ezekiel and Revelation. Remember, these four living creatures had four faces: the bull and the ox, the man, the eagle, and the lion. And I think they were what is distorted into these Mesopotamian Assyrian winged bulls. We also think of sphinxes. And we won't even go into the fact that there were probably flying dinosaurs like pterosaurs and pterodactyls that have become confused into this whole mess. I remember once showing a picture of a Babylonian dragon at a creation talk in North Wales, and then I showed the Welsh flag. No difference. That didn't go down very well. The Welsh dragon looks just like a Babylonian dragon because it came into Britain via the Romans and then via Arthur, the historical Arthur, that is. And so we see this never-ending continuum of confusion and madness. Now, we've also got the watchers and the angels. I think it's only in one Bible book that the angels are called watchers. And when we think back to the fallen angels, the mighty men, the Nephilim, mating with the daughters of men, and then when we confuse, we add dinosaurs and flying pterodactyls and whatever into the mix, and then we look at all these animal-headed people and people-headed animals. Again, that throughout the history of the occult, you look at shamans throughout the world who transform themselves into animals to supposedly converse with the heavens. And that's a common shamanistic belief from North America and Russia and South America and Africa and in Britain. Again, we've got another belief here of animals and people interacting, which is why it's so wrong with modern genetic engineering that they are mixing kinds. The kinds of Genesis, they're mixing animals with plants and other creatures genetically, and that is very, very bad. And that's just another offshoot of Babylon has got into medicine. There's a great example of it floating around at this very minute. But you know, those winged bulls are very, very common throughout this period. Now, this is where it gets even more confusing, because Nebuchadnezzar rebuilt the Tower of Babylon, the Tower of Babel. I can't get a very good reproduction of this, but if you look at Nebuchadnezzar here, can you see the tower here? The 7-step ziggurat here? It's not very clear. I'll have to adapt that so that it stands out more. But this is Nebuchadnezzar. This is the inscription off his stelae. The house, the foundation of heaven and earth. Because Babel, or Iana to them, is the house of heaven. That's what they knew the Tower of Babel as, the house of heaven, or Iana, or Etemenanki, the ziggurat of Babylon, the house, the foundation of the heaven and earth, otherwise known as the great ziggurat of Babylon. So the royal inscription from Nebuchadnezzar says, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, I, in order to complete Entemenanki and Imi-Anki, I don't know how you pronounce that, I mobilized all countries everywhere, each and every ruler who had been raised to prominence over all the people of the world, loved by Marduk, another name for the false god. From the upper sea to the lower sea, the distant nations, the teeming people of the world, kings of remote mountains and far-flung islands, the base I filled in to make a high terrace. I built their structures with bitumen and baked brick throughout. I completed it, raising its top to the heaven, making it gleam as bright as the sun. You might remember that in Egypt, it is thought that the final peak of the pyramids was covered with a metal cap to make it shine. Because the Egyptian pyramids, of course, were usually often limestone, which was very white, but these were made of baked brick. Now, either Nebuchadnezzar is confusing himself with Nimrod here, or he actually did rebuild the Tower of Babel, because again, it's not clear from the scriptures whether the Tower of Babel was ever completed. The Bible doesn't say that, but it was actually completed. Unless any of you have got an insight on that. But it was certainly, the remains were around by the time of Nebuchadnezzar, which is over 2,000 years later. And it was very much a part of Babylon, the Hanging Gardens, remember, one of the 7 wonders of the world at the time. So here we have a lot of ancient inscriptions, seem to show it as quite a tall tower, resembling more a South American temple than a pyramid, or this rather squat. But if this is the base, which I think has been rebuilt, this has been rebuilt in modern times. And of course, what's his name? The ruler of Iraq, Saddam Hussein, tried to rebuild quite a lot of Babylon. But it seems that Nebuchadnezzar at least tarted it up, the remains. But you can see all his titles here. Remember what happened to him in the book of Daniel. He was so proud that he was knocked to his knees for 7 weeks or 7 years or whatever. And made to eat like an animal. He had a very high idea about himself. So we can see, as Nimrod was supposedly the first one world dictator, Nebuchadnezzar still thought he himself was ruling the world. Whereas, of course, by this time, people had already got to the Americas, and the Indus Valley, the Hindu civilization and what have you, was already booming. And there are variations upon all of these sorts of civilizations throughout the world. So that was the later. And this is just a bit more confusion, I'm afraid, because moon gods and goddesses can also be sun gods, and they can transmute back into as well. It was known as Baal or El in the Near East, Baal, and Sin. In Egypt, the supreme god, who was also the sun god, was Ra. And in Gaelic, it became Bel. Bel came from Baal. And you can see El, one of the common names of God, with the B before it. And you've got endless variations upon these, and they can go back into as well. The god Sin is mentioned in Ezekiel 30, verse 16, as an actual entity, not the concept of sin, but the god of sin. And in Judges 8, they're called the Baalites. And we're also in Judges and Chronicles and Kings, we see them as Ishmaelites, and they have crescent moon ornaments on their camels, on their horses. They're already worshipping the crescent moon and have these symbols hanging from their animals at the very least. And then we see the transmogrification of El into Allah. Allah, of course, means the God. It's not an actual name. But there's another dreadful custom which is mentioned in the Old Testament on a couple of occasions, and that's the Asherah festival, which I'll mention in a minute. But I'm convinced that there was an original Semiramis, and she became Ishtar, she became Asherah, she became Artemis, she became Ashtaroth. It goes on and on and on. And Asheroth means tower builder, and then it became Isis and Venus and Diana. It just goes on and on. And the goddess of moon heaven became the queen of heaven. By the time we get to Jeremiah 7 and Ezekiel 8, the Jews are condemned for worshipping the queen of heaven. And what are they doing? They're worshiping, they're weeping for Tammuz. Nimrod has become Tammuz, the god that died, and died for the sins of the world. Now, where have we heard that before? I mean, it's astonishing when you look at all of these things were way before the cross. It's quite astonishing the way that Satan's preempted all of this stuff. And in Isaiah, she's also called the Lady of the Nations, as well as the Queen of Heaven, or the Queen of Kingdoms, depends upon your translation. But Lady of the Nations is another word used for her worship in the Catholic Church. But by the time we get to Revelation 13 and 17, she's become Mystery Babylon the Great. So these are individuals, they are concepts, they are world empire, and as Lucille pointed out earlier, they're entangled in everything. They're entangled in everything. The pre-Islamic god in the Kaaba in Mecca was Hubal, and that is thought to be the god Sin. So when Muhammad came to the Kaaba, he destroyed all the gods except Hubal. Is almost certainly Allah anyway. And of course, as we shall come to later, his three daughters, the satanic verses, but that's for the next bit. So Sin and Ishtar became Isis. We know what Isis is doing in the world today. Did you know this is also Britannia on our coins? It's also the Statue of Liberty. That's Artemis. In fact, that was a present from the French. I think that was a barb present from the French to the Americans, because that was actually Artemis, the Statue of Liberty. So Sin's supreme character passed in later times to his female counterpart, but she finally replaced him. So when the female aspect of the lunar deity came to displace the male, the wife of the moon god became identified with the moon itself, while the goddess Ishtar maintained her association with the planet Venus. This identification is symbolically represented by the lunar crescent enclosing the star within its horns, which is still the crest of Islam. I got that from a writer called Briffault many, many years ago. I can't even remember where I got that from. It doesn't really matter because we see it here today. Where do we see it here today? This is just a few of the flags of Islam, and the connection between the crescent moon and the star worship is crystal clear. It's exactly the same symbol with minor variations. It's also interesting, the three main colors, red, green, and white, but we won't go into that here. So the origin of the crescent moon is another confusion. I didn't write this, by the way. I put this together. I didn't write this. Isaiah 14:12, as I'm sure you know. How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? Thou art cut down to the ground, which did weaken the nations. Now the Hebrew for Lucifer is Hillel. I don't know how you pronounce that, by the way. Lucifer is not in any original Bible. That the Catholics put that name in just about 800 years ago. The name Lucifer in Hebrew is Hillel, however you pronounce that. According to Strong's dictionary, it means brightness, the morning star. But it has a similar meaning in Arabic, Hilal, not the butchering method. It's also associated with the crescent moon. So it's probably first worshipped in Ur and pre-Islamic Arabia. Later via Abraham and Keturah, the Midianites, and Ishmael, etc. So we see this enmity throughout the Bible from Abraham and Isaac and Ishmael down through Esau, etc., the Midianites. And I usually mention in passing at this time, if there are any Muslims actually listening, which of course is highly unlikely, that the Ishmaelites were also given 12 tribes to the east of the Jordan. Get back over there. Anyway, so that's, the Ishmaelites were treated very fairly. They're also given their 12 tribes, their 12 princes, and their lands to the east of the Jordan. So sorry, that's the reference in Judges 8 to their crescent moon ornaments on their animals. But there's another Islamic custom which has come down to us, which is mentioned there as well. Now this is just a stock picture of the four beasts, the four parts of the statue and the four beasts of Daniel's statue, Nebuchadnezzar's dreams. So we know that the head of gold is represented by the lion, talking of the Babylonian Empire, which was shortly to come to a close. That would be beaten by the Medo-Persian Empire, the body and the arms here, represented by the lopsided bear, because it was the Medes and the Persians were stronger than the Medes. Therefore, the three bones and the jaw of the bear. Greece was represented by the thighs of gold, etc., brass, and the leopard with the four wings. And we know that was representing the four generals, the four main generals after Alexander, the so-called Great, died. And the final beast is actually not actually named as a beast, is it? It's not a lion or a bear or a leopard. It's not actually named as an individual species or kind. It's so horrific. It's got all the qualities of the ones before it, including it has the 10 horns, including the little horn, which is also from Daniel 7 and Daniel 10. And we see them resurrected in Revelation 13 and fired by the dragon. But again, we're not going to go into that now. That's for the final bit, if we're all still here. Now, the four beasts of history, well, I've more or less just gone through all that. So we don't need to, just to say that there were two main generals that succeeded Alexander. They were the Seleucids. There were Seleucids and Ptolemy. So the Ptolemaic became the kings of the south, were represented mainly by Egypt, and the Seleucids became the kings of the north, represented mainly by Assyria. So when we look at the kings of the north and the kings of the south, the final battle in Daniel 11 and Daniel 12, we must remember what the prototypes were. This is not talking about a battle between America and China, as some people say today, although I've got no doubt they will be involved. But we've got to beware of saying Babylon is America and Babylon is this and Babylon is that. I think Babylon is actually a lot of things. So the Rome is represented by the iron legs and the clay feet. And again, you can see several interpretations of what the two legs stand for. Eastern, Western Catholicism, or pagan and papal Rome, whatever. But the 10 horns also stand for the 10 toes. And they include the little horn or the false prophet, almost probably the same person, on the 7 heads in Revelation 13, powered by Satan the dragon, the serpent dragon. So we say this is the finale of the battle that started in Genesis 3. Oh yeah, these are very poor pictures, but the 4 beast areas, again, when we look at the final battle, we must be careful not to transmit this. I think it is going to involve the whole world, the final battle, call it Armageddon. But all of these empires, this is the Babylonian Empire, this is the Medo-Persian, this is the Greco-Macedonian, this is the Roman Empire. They're always centered on Babylon. They often come to a beginning and an end in Babylon. Although, strangely enough, by the time we get to the Roman Empire, which city is at the center of that empire? No coincidence that Rome is at the center of that empire. Although I know Sheffield is on 7 hills as well, and they make pretty good knives. Lots of cities are on 7 hills. Now, these are the 4 empires. These are the beast areas. So when we look at the final battles in Daniel and Revelation, the kings of the north and the kings of the south, we've got to first and foremost look at this. We've also got to bring in Ezekiel 37, 38 and Psalm 83. Psalm 83 is like a inner ring attack, and Ezekiel 38, 39 is a sort of outer ring of Islam. But these things we'll look at more fully when we get to Revelation in the final study. And once again, I don't pretend that anything I say is in any way infallible. But these are things I've been looking at for a long time, and I've often changed my mind and could change my mind again. So how about having another break there for comments and questions?